The first signs appeared in early spring when the morning mist still clung heavy to the Monongahela National Forest. Jack Morrison had been hunting these woods for over 40 years, and he knew every creek, every ridge, and every animal trail that wound through the ancient trees. But what he found that morning made his weathered hands shake as he gripped his rifle. The deer carcass lay in a small clearing, but something was wrong about it. Morrison had seen plenty of kills in his time: bears, cougars, even the occasional wolf pack passing through. This was different. The creature's organs had been removed with surgical precision, leaving the rest of the body untouched. No blood stained the grass beneath it, as if every drop had been carefully drained away. Most disturbing of all were the strange marks along its spine, perfectly straight lines that no natural predator could have made. Morrison reported what he found to the local rangers, but they seemed strangely dismissive. Probably just some kids playing pranks, they said. But Morrison knew better. He'd seen the way his compass needle spun wildly when he approached certain parts of the forest. He'd noticed how the birds fell silent in areas where they used to sing. Something had changed in these woods he'd known all his life. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Throughout that spring, stories began circulating in the small towns that dotted the Appalachian foothills. Hunters spoke of strange lights moving through the trees at night, too low and too fast to be aircraft. Hikers reported patches of fog that seemed to appear out of nowhere, dense enough to blot out the sun and lingering long after the weather should have cleared it away. Electronics failed mysteriously. Phones lost signal in areas with usually perfect reception. Cameras stopped working, and GPS devices showed impossible coordinates. The old mining complex on the north side of the mountain had been abandoned for decades, but locals swore they saw vehicles coming and going at odd hours. Black SUVs with tinted windows and no license plates, moving silently along the overgrown access roads. When asked, local authorities claimed it was just routine maintenance checks, but maintenance doesn't require armed guards and tactical gear. The missing persons reports began in late April. First, it was a solo hiker who never returned to his car. Then, a pair of campers who missed their check-in date. By June, 5 people had vanished without a trace in the Monongahela forest. The official response was always the same: people get lost in the woods all the time. They probably wandered off trail. They weren't prepared for the wilderness. But these weren't inexperienced tourists. These were seasoned outdoors people who knew the area well. Park rangers began finding strange markings on trees deep in the forest, not carved by knives or claws, but seemingly burned into the bark with incredible precision. The marks appeared overnight in areas that had been pristine the day before. When photographs of the markings were sent to the state capitol for analysis, the rangers were told to stop documenting them. No explanation was given. The situation might have continued this way, a slow accumulation of strange occurrences and unexplained events, if not for what happened in July. That's when 5 students from Marshall University decided to spend a week hiking the Appalachian Trail. Their disappearance would crack open a door to something far darker than anyone could have imagined, something that powerful people had worked very hard to keep hidden. Thomas Walker organized the trip, a photography major with a passion for documenting Appalachia's natural beauty. He'd planned every detail meticulously. His photos from previous hikes showed an artist's eye for composition. Morning light filtering through mountain mist, ancient trees stretching toward the sky, rocky streams tumbling down moss-covered slopes. He had no way of knowing these would be his last photographs. Rebecca Hayes came along for the research opportunities. An environmental science student, she'd been tracking the effects of climate change on high-altitude vegetation. Her notebook was filled with careful observations and pressed leaves, each specimen meticulously labeled and dated. Michael Cooper, born and raised in the area, served as their unofficial guide. He'd grown up exploring these mountains and knew all the local stories, though he'd soon learned that some stories were better left untold. David Phillips was the experienced one, an avid hiker who'd completed the entire Appalachian Trail the previous summer. His expertise made the others feel safe. Lisa Thompson rounded out the group, a geology major who could read the mountain's history and its rock layers. She was the first to notice something odd about the stone formations near the old mine, but by then it was already too late. They checked in at the ranger station on Saturday morning, their packs loaded with a week's worth of supplies. The day was clear and warm, perfect hiking weather. Ranger Steve Dawson logged their intended route and return date, noting how well prepared they seemed. He would later remember an odd detail. All of their electronic devices started malfunctioning simultaneously while they were in the station. Phones, watches, and GPS units all reset themselves at exactly the same moment. At the time, everyone laughed it off as a strange coincidence. The group's last known communication came that evening, a call from Thomas's satellite phone to his mother. The connection was poor, breaking up with static, but a few phrases came through clearly. Strange fog, lights in the trees, something wrong with the compass. Then the line went dead. That call would become the first piece in a puzzle that would lead one man to uncover horrors beyond imagination, and a truth that powerful forces would kill to keep secret. The students were reported missing 3 days later when they failed to make their scheduled check-in. What followed was officially described as one of the largest search and rescue operations in West Virginia's history, but those who were there would later say something felt wrong about it from the start. The search teams were constantly being redirected away from certain areas, particularly around the old mine. Federal agents showed up within hours, unusually fast for a routine missing persons case. And then there were the sounds that echoed through the valleys at night, sounds that made even the search dogs whimper and refuse to continue. But this was only the beginning. The real story, the truth about what happened in those mountains, wouldn't begin to emerge until Samuel Anderson started asking questions. And what he would discover in his search for answers would change everything we thought we knew about what really goes on in the dark corners of Appalachia, in places where the government thinks no one is watching. Sam Anderson first heard about the missing hikers on the local news. He recognized Thomas Walker immediately. They'd grown up together in the same small town, spent countless summer days exploring the woods behind their houses. Now, seeing Thomas's photo on the screen alongside the other missing students, something deep in Sam's gut told him this was more than just another case of hikers losing their way. The official search had been called off after 2 weeks. The authorities cited dangerous weather conditions and lack of evidence, but their explanation felt hollow. Sam had attended the last press conference, watching from the back of the room as men in dark suits hovered behind the local sheriff. The message was clear: time to move on, nothing more to see here. But Sam couldn't move on, not when the last text he'd received from Thomas kept playing in his mind. "Something strange out here, Sam. The trees don't look right." Sam began his own investigation at the ranger station where the group had last been seen. Ranger Dawson was still there, and after some persuasion, he shared details that hadn't made it into the official report. The strange electronic malfunction, the way the air had felt charged, like just before a lightning storm, and something else. In the days following the disappearance, government officials had arrived and removed all the station's logbooks and equipment. They said it was routine, Dawson explained, glancing nervously at the windows. But in 30 years, I've never seen anything like it. And the suits they wore, those weren't standard issue. The ranger's unease was palpable, but he agreed to mark on Sam's map the areas the search teams had been specifically ordered to avoid. The pattern was striking, a rough circle centered around the old Blackwood mine complex. The mine had its own strange history. Officially closed in 1987 after a series of accidents, locals remembered how quickly the government had moved to secure the site. The official explanation was environmental hazards, but Sam's research in the town library's archives painted a different picture. Before its closure, the mine had been producing far more electricity than a standard mining operation should need. Satellite photos from the period showed unusual structures that didn't match any known mining equipment. Carol Bennett, who'd worked in the mine's administrative office until its closure, agreed to meet Sam at a diner just outside of town. Her hands shook as she stirred her coffee. They started bringing in the new equipment in a 85, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it didn't go down to the coal seams. They were building something else down there, something deep. The miners weren't allowed past the 4th level anymore, but they talked about the sounds that came from below, the screams. She pushed a yellowed envelope across the table. Inside were photographs, grainy security camera stills showing long corridors that looked more like a research facility than a mine, men in hazmat suits, strange containers being transported under heavy guard. The day they shut us down, they made everyone sign papers, said we'd be violating national security if we ever talked about what we saw, but I kept these, because sometimes at night, I still hear those sounds, and they're getting closer. Sam's investigation led him to more witnesses, each with another piece of the puzzle. A former guard who spoke of strange lights and unexplained power surges, a nurse who'd treated miners for unusual radiation burns, a geologist who'd discovered that the mine's deepest levels didn't appear on any official surveys. But it was Mary Blackwood, the mine owner's widow, who provided the crucial link. Living in a sprawling Victorian mansion on the edge of town, she'd kept her husband's private records. Among them was a contract with a company called Advanced Biomedical Research Initiatives, ABRI. The company's letterhead bore a Department of Defense header, and the contract mentioned something called Project Westwood. Further digging revealed ABRI's involvement in classified government research throughout the 1980s and 90s. The projects were officially labeled as medical research for military applications, but buried in redacted documents and forgotten filing cabinets, Sam found hints of something far more sinister: genetic modification, human enhancement, experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of both science and ethics. The company had supposedly been dissolved in 1999 after a congressional investigation into ethical violations, but Sam discovered recent property records showing that ABRI still owned land near the old mine complex, land that officially didn't exist on any public maps. As Sam pieced together the connections, a pattern began to emerge. The missing hikers weren't the first to vanish in these mountains. Every few years, people disappeared, always in groups, always in the same general area. The official explanations varied, but the response was always the same: brief searches, quick conclusions, and federal agents making sure no one asked too many questions. But it was what Sam found in Thomas's cloud storage that truly broke the case open. Thomas had set his phone to automatically upload photos to a private account, an account he'd shared with Sam years ago and apparently forgotten about. The last uploads had come through the day before the group disappeared. Most were typical hiking photos, but the final images showed something else, something that would lead Sam to the truth about what really happened in those mountains, and nearly cost him his life in the process. The first unusual photo showed a metal door set into a hillside, partially hidden by vegetation. It looked recently used. No rust, well-maintained hinges. The next several images captured strange lights in the forest, orb-like illuminations that seemed to hover between the trees. But it was the last photo that made Sam's blood run cold. Taken at dusk, it showed a figure standing between two distant trees. The image was grainy, but clear enough to see that something was wrong with the figure's proportions. Its limbs were too long, its head misshapen. The photo's metadata showed it was taken just minutes before Thomas's final phone call. Sam spent the next week preparing. He bought camping equipment, a high-end camera with night vision capabilities, and a satellite phone. He also made copies of everything he'd discovered, storing them in secure locations. If something happened to him, he wanted to make sure the truth wouldn't disappear. He started his expedition on a cool autumn morning, following the hiking group's original route. The forest felt different now, oppressive, watching. Every snapping twig made him jump, every shadow seemed to move. He found their first campsite exactly where the search teams had reported it. The tents were still there, untouched after months of exposure to the elements. Inside, their belongings lay exactly as they'd left them, no signs of panic or struggle, as if the group had simply vanished into thin air. Near the campsite, Sam discovered something the search teams had missed. Hidden beneath a fallen log was Rebecca Hayes' research journal. The last entry described unusual changes in the local vegetation, plants growing in impossible patterns, trees that seemed to bend away from certain areas of the forest, and most disturbing of all, her final note: the moss grows wrong near the old mine. It's like it's trying to escape from something. Following her observations, Sam made his way toward the Blackwood mine. The vegetation did change, becoming sparser, darker, wrong somehow. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. His compass spun uselessly and his phone showed no signal, but he kept going, documenting everything with his camera. As dusk approached, he found the metal door from Thomas's photo. Up close, he could see it wasn't just a mine entrance. It was a sophisticated security door with a keypad and camera system. The surrounding rock had been carefully engineered to make it look natural from a distance. Someone was still maintaining this facility, and they'd gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. Sam was setting up his camera when he heard the humming. It started as a low vibration, more felt than heard, but it grew steadily stronger until it made his teeth ache. Then came the lights, not flashlights or headlamps, but a sickly green glow that seemed to seep from the ground itself. From his hiding spot behind a boulder, Sam watched as the door opened. Two men in dark military-style uniforms emerged, followed by something Sam's mind refused to fully process. It moved like a person, but its proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways. Its skin had a translucent quality that revealed shadowy movements beneath. As it passed his hiding spot, it turned its head in a way that no human neck could move, and for a moment, Sam felt sure it knew he was there. The group disappeared into the forest, and Sam waited until the humming faded before approaching the door. It had been left slightly ajar, an oversight that would give him his only chance to uncover the truth. With his heart pounding, he slipped inside. The corridor beyond was a stark contrast to the rustic mine entrance. Sterile white walls, fluorescent lighting, and the smell of hospital disinfectant. Security cameras were mounted at regular intervals, but they hung limp, disabled. Emergency lights cast red shadows along the walls, and somewhere in the distance, an alarm was sounding. Sam moved deeper into the facility, documenting everything with his camera. He passed laboratories filled with complex equipment, observation rooms with one-way glass, and rows of empty cells. But it was what he found in the central research area that made him understand the true horror of what had been happening beneath the mountains. The room was massive, circular, with a high ceiling dotted with various types of monitoring equipment. Along the walls were large tubes filled with cloudy liquid, each connected to sophisticated monitoring stations. Most were empty, but some contained shapes, human shapes, or what had once been human. They were changing, transforming into something else. Some looked partially melted, others had extra limbs growing from impossible places. But the worst part was that they were conscious. Their eyes followed him as he moved through the room, and their hands pressed against the glass, not in aggression but in a desperate plea for help. On a central computer terminal, Sam found files detailing Project Westwood's true purpose. The government hadn't been trying to create super soldiers. That was just the cover story. They were trying to change the fundamental nature of human biology, to create beings that could survive in environments that would kill ordinary people. The applications were meant for deep space exploration, deep sea habitation, even survival in post-nuclear conditions. But something had gone wrong. The transformations had become unpredictable, uncontrollable, and the test subjects' minds had remained intact, trapped inside their changing bodies. A video file caught his attention, dated the day Thomas and his group disappeared. The footage showed them being brought into the facility, unconscious. Men in hazmat suits moved them to different chambers. The next clips documented their progress, daily recordings of horrific transformations. Sam forced himself to watch until he saw Thomas's face, still recognizable despite the changes beginning to warp his features. His friend was alive, but trapped in a nightmare beyond imagination. The sound of voices echoing down the corridor snapped Sam back to his immediate danger. He quickly copied as many files as he could onto his phone, hands shaking as he worked. The voices were getting closer. As he turned to leave, movement in one of the tubes caught his eye. The figure inside pressed its hand against the glass. It wore a familiar ring, Lisa Thompson's class ring. Sam reached out instinctively, placing his hand against the glass. The being inside mimicked his gesture. Through the murky liquid, he could see her eyes. Still human, still aware. She moved her other hand in a writing motion. On the foggy glass, she traced 3 letters. Run. The voices were almost at the door now. Sam ducked behind a row of empty tubes as 2 scientists entered, engrossed in conversation. The latest batch is showing better stability, one said, reviewing data on a tablet. But the consciousness retention is still problematic. They remember too much. The general won't be happy about that, the other replied. The whole point was to create adaptable operators who could follow orders. These subjects keep their human memories, their connections, makes them unreliable. Well, the new protocol should help with that. Once we start the next phase, an alarm blared through the facility, cutting off their conversation. Red emergency lights began flashing. Containment breach in Sector 7, a voice announced over the intercom. All personnel evacuate immediately, security teams to Sector 7. This is not a drill. The scientists rushed out, leaving Sam alone in the chamber. The emergency lights cast crimson shadows across the tubes, making their occupants appear to shift and move in the darkness. Another alarm joined the first, then another. The facility's systems were going haywire. Through the chaos, Sam heard something else, a sound like tearing metal, followed by inhuman screams. The power flickered, plunging the room into darkness for several seconds before the emergency generators kicked in. When the lights returned, Sam saw that some of the tubes were empty. Their occupants had somehow escaped. He ran for the exit, no longer trying to stay hidden. The corridors were in chaos, personnel running in all directions, alarms blaring and terrible sounds echoing through the facility. He passed rooms where other containers had been breached, leaving only broken glass and puddles of fluid. Whatever had been inside them was now loose. Rounding a corner, Sam collided with someone, Dr. James Franklin, according to his ID badge. The scientist grabbed Sam's arm, his eyes wild with panic. "You don't understand what you've done," Franklin gasped. "The power fluctuations, they've disrupted the containment fields. Everything's getting out." "These were people," Sam shot back. "You turned them into monsters." "We were trying to save humanity," Franklin's voice rose hysterically. "You think this world will stay habitable forever? We needed to adapt, to evolve. The changes were necessary." A horrific scream cut through their argument. Close, too close. At the end of the corridor, a figure emerged from the shadows. It had once been human, but now it moved in a way that defied anatomy, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Behind it, more shapes appeared, each more nightmarish than the last. "Run," Franklin whispered. "Run now. They remember who did this to them." Sam didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the exit as chaos erupted behind him. Franklin's screams were cut short with a wet gurgling sound. The corridor filled with the sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, but a horrible sliding, scraping noise that seemed to come from all directions. He reached the security door, fumbling with the emergency release as the sounds grew closer. Finally, it swung open, and he burst out into the night air. But the horror wasn't confined to the facility anymore. Strange sounds echoed through the forest. Trees swayed without wind, and somewhere in the darkness, something was watching. Sam ran blindly through the forest, his only light coming from the moon and the strange, pulsing glow that now seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Behind him, the facility's alarms continued to wail, their sound distorting as it echoed through the trees. The emergency lights cast long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The forest had changed. The trees looked wrong, their bark rippling in patterns that hurt his eyes. The ground beneath his feet felt soft and unstable, as if something were moving under the soil. The air had become thick and heavy, carrying an unfamiliar scent that reminded him of hospitals and decay. He heard movement in the darkness, not just from behind, but from all around him. Shapes darted between the trees, their movements too fluid to be human. Some crawled along the ground while others moved through the canopy above, making the branches sway and crack. He recognized them as the transformed test subjects, now free from their containment tubes. But they weren't attacking, they were hurting him. A familiar figure stepped into his path, illuminated by that strange, pulsing light. It took Sam several seconds to recognize what remained of Thomas Walker. His friend's body had been twisted and changed, but his eyes were still the same. They held recognition, awareness, and something else, a desperate warning. Sam, the voice was barely human, distorted and rough. You have to tell them what they did to us, what we're becoming. Before Sam could respond, bright lights swept through the trees. The sound of helicopters filled the air, accompanied by radio chatter and the thud of heavy boots on forest floor. The government's containment teams had arrived. Thomas and the other transformed beings melted into the shadows with impossible speed. Sam ran again, but now he was running from both the creatures and the armed men pursuing them. He could hear orders being barked through radio headsets. Capture if possible, terminate if necessary, no witnesses. Sam's salvation came in the form of an old storm drain he remembered from his childhood explorations. He squeezed inside just as a search team passed by, their boots splashing through the creek bed above him. He waited there for hours, listening to the sounds of the pursuit echoing through the forest. Eventually, the noise faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the night. But even those seemed different now, altered, like everything else in these mountains. He emerged at dawn, making his way back to town through little-used hunting trails. The official story was already being spread. A chemical leak at an old storage facility, nothing to worry about, everything contained. News reports advised residents to avoid the forest while cleanup teams did their work. No mention of missing hikers, no mention of the horrors that had been unleashed. Sam spent the next week attempting to expose the truth. He uploaded the facility's files to multiple secure servers, sent copies to journalists and watchdog organizations, but within hours, the files would vanish. Websites crashed, email accounts were deleted, every digital trace of evidence disappeared, as if it had never existed. The journalists who had seemed interested in the story suddenly stopped responding to his calls. One reporter who had agreed to meet him was found dead in her apartment, an apparent suicide, though she had no history of depression and had just received a major promotion. Black SUVs began appearing outside Sam's house. His phone calls had strange echoes and clicks. People he tried to talk to about that night would suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. The message was clear: stay quiet or disappear. But the truth couldn't be contained as easily as digital files. Stories began spreading through the mountain communities. Hunters reported strange creatures moving through the forest at night. Hikers spoke of areas where plant life grew in impossible ways. Park rangers quit their jobs without explanation, and people continued to disappear, not in groups anymore, but ones and twos quietly, without fuss. The government expanded the restricted area around the old mine, citing environmental hazards. They built new fences, installed security systems, and posted armed guards. But they were trying to contain something that had already escaped. The changes had taken root in the mountains themselves, spreading through soil and water and air. Sam writes this account from a small cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness. He knows they'll find him eventually. The transformed beings visit him sometimes. Creatures that were once his friends, now something beyond human understanding. They bring him evidence of what's happening in the mountains. Photographs, documents, samples. The changes are accelerating, spreading. Thomas came to him last night, his form now so altered that only his eyes remained recognizable. He brought a warning. What happened in West Virginia wasn't an isolated incident. There are other facilities, other experiments. The government didn't create something new in those mountains. They awakened something that was already there, something that had been waiting, and now it's free. The lights are moving through the trees again. They've found him, but the truth is already out there, spreading like spores on the wind. In the mountains of West Virginia, something is still happening, still growing, still changing, and it's only the beginning.